You are standing at almost 13,000 feet above sea level, on a treeless plain of dry brown grass in the Bolivian Andes, and the air is so thin it takes a moment just to get used to breathing it. In front of you is a single stone doorway, carved from one solid block of gray volcanic rock, standing alone in the open like a door that leads nowhere, because the walls that once surrounded it are long gone. Above the doorway, worn but still legible after more than 1,000 years of wind and frost, a carved figure stands at the center of a dense, almost overwhelming field of smaller carved figures, a being holding two staffs, wearing a headdress that radiates outward like rays of the sun, flanked on both sides by rows of winged attendants running toward it in profile, as if caught mid-stride forever. This is the gateway of the sun, and it is only one piece of a city that the people who eventually conquered this entire region, the Inca, builders of one of the largest empires in the pre-Columbian Americas, looked at with something close to awe, and admitted, in their own oral histories, that they had not built it. It was already ancient when the Inca arrived. Nobody, including the Inca themselves, could say with confidence who had built it, or why, several centuries after the people who did had already vanished from the record entirely. That city is called Tiwanaku, and for a civilization that once controlled trade and religious life across a huge stretch of the south-central Andes, it is strikingly absent from popular memory today, especially outside South America. Ask most people to name a lost civilization of the ancient Americas and you will hear about the Inca, the Maya, the Aztec, cultures with dramatic conquest stories, familiar names, famous ruins. Tiwanaku built one of the largest and most influential states in the entire pre-Columbian Andes, centuries before the Inca even existed as a political entity, and then it collapsed so completely and so mysteriously that even its own likely descendants, the Aymara-speaking people who still live around Lake Titicaca today, do not claim direct cultural continuity with the specific rulers who built it. What survives is stone, pyramids, sunken courtyards, gateways carved from single slabs of rock, and, most strangely of all, at a site nearby called Puma Punku, blocks of hard volcanic andesite cut with such precision that flat surfaces fit against each other with almost no visible gap, carved, as best modern archaeology can determine, using nothing more advanced than stone hammers, sand, and patience. Let's go back to the frozen shore of the highest large lake on Earth, and follow the rise, the genuine mystery, and the strange, still debated ending of the empire that built it. Tiwanaku sits a short distance south of Lake Titicaca, on the Bolivian side of the modern border with Peru, on what is known as the Altiplano, a vast, high, cold plateau wedged between two parallel mountain ranges of the Andes, sitting at an elevation where trees mostly do not grow and where nighttime frost is a near-constant threat even during the growing season. This is, by almost any conventional measure, one of the least hospitable places on Earth to build a major city. The air holds roughly 40% less oxygen than it does at sea level. Growing seasons are short and unpredictable. And yet by around the 6th or 7th century of the Common Era, a walled ceremonial and residential center had grown up here into what many archaeologists now consider one of the largest cities in the world at that time by population, a genuine urban center supporting, by some estimates, tens of thousands of permanent residents in a landscape that should barely have been able to feed a village. Understanding how that was possible turns out to be one of the more genuinely underrated engineering stories in ancient history, and we will come back to it. But first, it helps to understand how strange this city already looked to the very people who eventually inherited it. Lake Titicaca itself sits at the center of Andean cosmology in a way that is hard to overstate. In the mythology later recorded from the Inca, who rose to power roughly 3 to 4 centuries after Tiwanaku's collapse and eventually built an empire stretching the length of the Andes, the creator god Viracocha is said to have emerged from the waters of Lake Titicaca in a time of darkness, and to have created the sun, the moon, and the stars at a specific place on its shores before sending them up into the sky to bring the first light to the world. According to several versions of this myth recorded by Spanish chroniclers after the Conquest, the place where Viracocha performed this act of creation was Tiwanaku itself. The Inca, in other words, did not treat these ruins as simply old buildings sitting in their territory. They treated them as the literal birthplace of the sun, sacred ground predating their own dynasty, predating recorded memory, a place their own origin myths located at the very beginning of time. And this reverence sat alongside a plain, repeated admission in their own oral tradition: they had not built it. Someone else had, long before, and by the time the Inca arrived to claim the site as sacred, whoever that someone else was had already been gone for centuries. The first written European account of Tiwanaku comes from a Spanish conquistador and chronicler named Pedro Cieza de Leon, who traveled extensively through the newly conquered Inca territories in the 1540s and published his account, the Crónica del Perú, in 1553. Cieza de Leon visited the ruins himself and pressed local indigenous informants, by then living under Inca, and soon Spanish, rule, for an explanation of who had built the massive stone structures scattered across the plain. Their answer, as he recorded it, was direct and somewhat startling. The buildings, they told him, had existed before the Inca Empire existed at all, built by people about whom nothing certain was known, in a time so far removed from living memory that even origin stories had nothing solid to offer beyond vague suggestions of giants or of a single catastrophic night in which the whole city had been raised into existence at once. Cieza de Leon, to his credit as an observer, wrote plainly that the builders of these great foundations were unknown, and that nobody could say with confidence how much time had passed since their era. He was, without fully realizing the scale of what he was describing, documenting the ruins of what modern archaeology now recognizes as one of the most important state-level societies to ever exist in South America before European contact, already a genuine historical mystery, 4.5 centuries before anyone would begin systematically excavating it. That systematic excavation, when it eventually came, revealed a ceremonial core considerably larger and more sophisticated than the scattering of scattered stones Cieza de Leon had described. At the heart of Tiwanaku stands the Akapana, a stepped earthen platform mound faced with cut stone, rising roughly 60 feet above the surrounding plain, modest by the standards of Egyptian or Mesoamerican pyramids, but a genuinely massive undertaking on a treeless, high-altitude plateau where every stone block had to be quarried, transported, and hauled into position without draft animals capable of pulling serious weight, since llamas, the only large domesticated animal available to Andean cultures, can carry modest loads but cannot pull heavy sledges the way oxen or horses can. What makes the Akapana particularly interesting to modern archaeologists is not simply its size but its plumbing. Excavations have revealed a network of stone-lined internal drainage channels running through the body of the mound itself, designed to capture rainwater falling on its stepped terraces and funnel it down through the structure to moats and channels at its base, a level of hydraulic sophistication that implies not just religious ambition but genuine, tested engineering knowledge, refined presumably over generations of trial, failure, and adjustment on a plateau where managing water, in a climate of short intense rainy seasons followed by long dry stretches, was a matter of survival rather than convenience. Just beside the Akapana sits a raised rectangular platform known as the Calisasaya, enclosed by tall upright sandstone pillars, and it is here, originally, that the gateway of the sun stood before it was moved to its current freestanding position sometime after the site had already fallen into ruin. Nobody knows exactly when or by whom, another small mystery layered on top of the larger one. The gateway itself is carved from a single block of andesite estimated to weigh around 10 tons, and the central figure on its frieze, generally referred to today as the staff god and widely associated by later Andean peoples with the same creator deity, Viracocha, holds a staff in each hand and radiates a halo of stylized rays ending alternately in the heads of condors and human faces. Surrounding this central figure, in 3 tightly packed horizontal rows, run 48 smaller winged figures, arranged with an almost obsessive symmetry. Some scholars have argued the carving encodes a calendar, a repeating count of days or ceremonial periods embedded directly into the arrangement of the figures, though, like a great deal about Tiwanaku's religious life, the precise meaning of the gateway's imagery remains genuinely debated rather than definitively solved. Immediately adjacent to the Calisasaya, sunk several feet below the surrounding ground level, is a rectangular sunken courtyard archaeologists call the semi-subterranean temple, and it is, in its own quiet way, one of the more unsettling spaces at the site. Its retaining walls are studded with dozens of separately carved stone heads, each one different from the others, some serene, some grimacing, a few with tongues protruding, set into the stonework at irregular intervals like a gallery of individual faces staring outward from the walls of a courtyard that would originally have been reached by descending a short flight of steps. Nobody has ever established with certainty what these carved heads were meant to represent: trophy heads taken in ritual combat, ancestor portraits, representations of subject peoples incorporated into the Tiwanaku state, or something else entirely. All remain live hypotheses. Standing at the center of this sunken courtyard when it was excavated in 1932 by the American archaeologist Wendell Bennett was a monolithic stone figure now known, after him, as the Bennett Monolith, at roughly 24 feet tall and an estimated 20 tons, the largest known carved monolithic statue anywhere in the pre-Columbian Americas. Carved with the same staff and headdress iconography found on the Gateway of the Sun, its surface covered in low-relief carving so dense and detailed. It has taken specialists years to fully catalogue. This is a good point to pause for a moment, because if the idea of standing among stones like these, carved by a civilization whose own descendants, and even the empire that later conquered them, could not say who built them, is the kind of mystery that keeps pulling you further in, this channel exists for exactly that feeling. New episodes on lost cities, vanished empires, and unsolved archaeological puzzles go up regularly, so if you'd like more evenings spent drifting through stories like this one, this is a good moment to hit subscribe before we go further into the stone. None of what we've covered so far, though, is the detail that has made Tiwanaku genuinely famous, infamous, in certain corners of the internet, well beyond the community of Andean archaeologists who study it professionally. That distinction belongs to a separate, smaller complex about a third of a mile from the main ceremonial core, called Puma Punku, meaning, roughly, door of the Puma, in the Aymara language spoken in the region today. Puma Punku is, by any honest assessment, in far worse physical condition than the rest of Tiwanaku. Centuries of stone robbing, treasure hunting, and, in a particularly damaging episode, the deliberate removal of large quantities of cut stone in the early 20th century to serve as ballast and building material for a nearby railway line, have left it looking today less like an intact structure and more like a scattered field of massive, disconnected blocks, some upright, most lying at odd angles exactly where centuries of disturbance left them. And it is precisely because those scattered blocks are so obviously, strikingly well made that Puma Punku has become, for a certain kind of documentary and a certain corner of alternative history writing, ground zero for claims about lost ancient supertechnology. The stones in question are cut from andesite, a hard volcanic rock, and hauled from a source believed to be several miles away, a serious feat of transport on its own, at this altitude, without wheeled vehicles or heavy draft animals. What draws attention is not simply that the blocks are large, but that many of them display an almost machine precision, flat faces meeting other flat faces at clean right angles, drilled holes of consistent diameter spaced at regular, repeating intervals, complex interlocking H-shaped blocks apparently designed to fit against identical neighboring blocks with barely a hairline gap between them. Photographed up close, several of these blocks genuinely do look like something produced by an industrial process rather than hand tools, and that visual impression is exactly what has fueled decades of speculation. Figures ranging from mid-century pseudo-archaeologists to certain popular television documentaries have argued, in various forms, that stonework this precise simply could not have been achieved by a Bronze Age or even Iron Age society working without metal tools, and have proposed instead that Puma Punku was built with the assistance of advanced lost technology, or, in the more extreme versions of the claim, was not built by humans at all. Mainstream Andean archaeology treats these claims with something between mild exasperation and genuine scientific interest in explaining exactly how the precision was actually achieved, because dismissing a mystery is not the same thing as solving it, and the honest answer took real experimental work to establish. Andesite is harder than granite, and Tiwanaku's stoneworkers had no iron or steel tools of any kind, but experimental archaeology conducted over the past several decades, physically attempting to replicate the cutting and shaping techniques with materials that would actually have been available, has demonstrated that andesite can be worked using nothing more exotic than harder hammerstones for rough shaping, followed by patient abrasion with wet sand and increasingly fine stone or bone tools. For finishing flat surfaces and edges, the same basic family of techniques, adapted to local materials, used by stoneworking cultures on multiple continents without metal tools. What experimental replication has not fully explained, and what continues to generate legitimate scholarly interest rather than fringe speculation, is less the how than the why and the extent, the sheer investment of skilled labor and organized planning required to produce dozens of interlocking blocks to matching tolerances, apparently intended to be assembled and disassembled as modular architectural units, represents a level of standardization that is genuinely unusual for the ancient Americas and still not fully explained in terms of the social organization and specialized craft training it would have required to produce reliably, generation after generation. The more interesting version of the Puma Punku mystery, in other words, is not that ancient humans could not possibly have built it, they almost certainly did, using known techniques we can replicate today, but that a specific, specialized body of technical knowledge, precise enough to be genuinely startling more than 1,000 years later, existed within Tiwanaku society, was passed down and refined over generations, and was then, along with so much else about this civilization, simply lost. When the society that produced it collapsed, leaving behind a level of craftsmanship its own later neighbors could not replicate and eventually could not even fully explain. That gap in explanation was made considerably worse, for the better part of the 20th century, by one particular researcher whose conclusions, however sincerely held, actively distorted the site's real history for decades. Arthur Poznański, an Austrian Bolivian engineer and self-taught archaeologist, spent much of his career, from roughly 1910 through the 1940s, developing an elaborate argument that Tiwanaku was vastly older than any conventional chronology allowed, dating the site's original construction, based on his own astronomical alignment calculations at the Calacasaya platform, to somewhere between 15 and 17,000 years before the present, which would place it not merely before the Inca, but before the last ice age had fully ended, before agriculture existed anywhere on Earth, among the very oldest claimed monumental structures ever proposed by any researcher. Poznański's astronomical method rested on measuring the angle of solstice alignments at the site and working backward, using the slow, measurable wobble of Earth's axial tilt over millennia, to calculate how long ago the platform's orientation would have precisely matched the solstice sunrise, a method that sounds rigorous and, to be fair to Poznański, uses real astronomical physics. But that depends entirely on an unproven assumption that the builders intended millimeter-precise solstice alignment in the first place, an assumption modern archaeoastronomers do not accept was reliably justified by the evidence at the site. Radiocarbon dating, developed decades after Poznański's key publications and applied systematically to organic material recovered from Tiwanaku's structures beginning in the mid-20th century, has since placed the site's actual chronology on far more solid ground, and it tells a very different, though in its own way no less remarkable, story. The area around Tiwanaku shows evidence of small agricultural settlement reaching back to roughly the 2nd or 3rd century before the Common Era, but the major monumental construction, the Akapana, the Kalisasaya, the semi-subterranean temple, and Puma Punku itself, dates to a considerably later and much more compressed window, broadly the 6th through 10th centuries of the Common Era, with the city's peak as a genuine regional political and religious capital generally placed between roughly 500 and 1000 CE. That is still, by any reasonable standard, extraordinary, a high-altitude urban center reaching a population in the tens of thousands, exercising religious and probably political influence across a huge swath of the south-central Andes stretching into what is now Peru, northern Chile, and northwestern Argentina, centuries before the rise of the Inca. It is simply not 17,000 years old, and Poznański's ultimately discredited dating, however well-intentioned, spent decades doing real damage to the site's credibility among mainstream historians, and inadvertently supplied a great deal of the raw material later recycled by pseudo-archaeological claims about lost prehistoric supercivilizations, precisely because a genuinely trained engineer had put his professional credibility behind a headline-grabbing number that turned out to be wrong by a factor of roughly 20. The real chronology, once properly established, raises a question at least as interesting as anything in Poznański's mistaken timeline: how did a city at this altitude, on this plateau, support a population large enough to build monuments on this scale in the first place? The answer lies not in the temples themselves but in the fields that surrounded them, in an agricultural technology known to archaeologists as succocalis, or raised field agriculture. Rather than farming the flat, frost-prone, poorly drained land of the Altiplano directly, Tiwanaku's farmers constructed long, raised earthen planting platforms, each one separated from its neighbors by narrow flooded canals dug down to the water table. This design solved several problems simultaneously in a genuinely elegant piece of low-technology engineering. The canals provided irrigation during dry spells, drained excess water during the intense rainy season, and, this is the detail modern researchers consider most remarkable, the standing water in the canals absorbed solar heat during the day and released it slowly overnight, raising the local air temperature around the growing plants by several critical degrees and measurably reducing the risk of the frost damage that would otherwise devastate crops at this elevation almost every growing season. Experimental reconstructions of succocalis fields carried out by archaeologists in the late 20th century demonstrated yields dramatically higher than conventional dry farming at the same altitude, and it is this system, refined and expanded across the centuries of Tiwanaku's rise, that most plausibly explains how a plateau this harsh came to support one of the largest urban populations in the pre-Columbian Andes, and how a state built on that agricultural surplus was able to project religious and political influence across such a wide surrounding region, establishing colonies and trading outposts as far as the Pacific coast and the lower, warmer valleys to the east, exchanging highland goods for maize, coca, and other crops that could not be grown on the Altiplano itself. Tiwanaku's reach extended well beyond the shores of Lake Titicaca. Archaeologists have identified what appear to be Tiwanaku colonies and outposts hundreds of miles from the Altiplano, in the lower, warmer valleys of what is now the Moquegua region of southern Peru, where highland-style pottery, textiles, and even Tiwanaku-style architecture show up alongside local material culture, suggesting either direct colonization or a degree of cultural and religious influence strong enough to be adopted voluntarily by distant communities. Around the same centuries, several hundred miles to the northwest, a separate and roughly contemporary state known as the Wari Empire was expanding out of the highlands of central Peru, and for a long time the relationship between these two powers, Tiwanaku and Wari, rising and flourishing at broadly the same time, sharing some strikingly similar religious iconography including versions of the same staff-bearing deity found on Tiwanaku's Gateway of the Sun, was one of the open questions in Andean archaeology. Some early researchers proposed the two were essentially a single unified empire under different regional names. Most specialists today treat them instead as two separate, powerful, and probably at least occasionally rival states that shared a common religious and iconographic tradition without ever fully merging politically, trading and influencing each other across a shifting frontier for several centuries before both, within a broadly similar window of time, went into their own separate and still not fully explained declines. The Bennett monolith, meanwhile, had its own strange modern history after Wendell Bennett pulled it from the semi-subterranean temple in 1932. It was relocated to a plaza in La Paz, Bolivia's capital, where it stood exposed to open-air pollution and weather for decades, suffering visible surface damage that alarmed conservators, before being returned to Tiwanaku in 2002 and placed inside a dedicated on-site museum, where it now stands under cover, a short walk from the Sunken courtyard where it was originally found. Tiwanaku itself was formally recognized as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2000, a designation that has brought increased funding for both excavation and conservation, even as looting and stone removal in earlier centuries mean a meaningful percentage of the site's original material, including large amounts of cut stone from Puma Punku specifically, is permanently gone, repurposed into colonial-era buildings, churches, and, as already mentioned, a 20th-century railway line, a reminder that the mystery archaeologists are working with today is already a smaller and more damaged version of what once stood on this plain. And then, sometime in the 11th century, all of it came apart, and precisely how and why remains one of the more actively contested chronological debates in Andean archaeology today. For decades, the standard explanation pointed to climate, sediment cores pulled from the bed of Lake Titicaca and ice cores drilled from the nearby Quilquea ice cap in Peru both show clear evidence of a significant, sustained drying trend beginning sometime around the 11th or 12th century, with lake levels dropping by an estimated 10 meters or more from their earlier highs. A Succa-Kalu field system, however cleverly engineered, ultimately depends on a reliable water table and a reasonably predictable rainy season to keep its canals functioning, and a prolonged multi-generational drought severe enough to lower an entire lake by 10 meters would, on the face of it, seem more than sufficient to explain the collapse of an agricultural system this finely tuned to existing climate conditions, and the political and social unraveling that would inevitably follow the loss of a food surplus large enough to support tens of thousands of urban, non-farming residents. More recent research, though, has complicated this tidy narrative considerably, in a way that has genuinely split specialists rather than settling the question. A detailed Bayesian statistical analysis of radiocarbon dates from Tiwanaku, published in the early 2020s and incorporating a much larger and more carefully calibrated body of excavation data than earlier studies had access to, suggests that the collapse of the city itself, the abandonment of monumental construction, the cessation of large-scale ritual activity at the ceremonial core, happened considerably faster, and considerably earlier, than the drought evidence would predict. In a compressed window some researchers now place at roughly 1000 to 1050 CE, potentially spanning as little as 20 years rather than a slow multi-generational decline. If that faster chronology holds up under further scrutiny, it creates a genuine problem for the simple drought explanation, because the clearest signs of serious, sustained drying in the regional climate record do not fully register until later in the 12th century, potentially a full century or more after the city at the center of the empire had already emptied out. Some archaeologists have responded to this apparent mismatch by proposing that the true cause of Tiwanaku's collapse lay less in the climate and more within Tiwanaku's own political structure, a sudden, violent internal upheaval, factional conflict among the elite lineages that controlled the ceremonial core, a breakdown in whatever combination of religious authority and economic control had held the wider Tiwanaku sphere together for half a millennium, that tore the political center apart. Well before the region's water supply had meaningfully failed, with the subsequent drought perhaps finishing off what internal collapse had already started, or simply making any recovery or rebuilding effort impossible in the generations that followed. What almost everyone studying the site agrees on, regardless of which side of that specific debate they lean toward, is that Tiwanaku's ending does not look like a conquest. There is no clear archaeological layer of citywide burning, no scattered evidence of a defending population cut down by an invading army, none of the blunt force signature that typically accompanies a city destroyed by outside enemies. What the archaeological record shows instead is a great ceremonial center that had been continuously built up, maintained, and richly used for roughly 5 centuries, simply stopping, construction ending, elite burials tapering off, the elaborate, labor-intensive Sakakala fields gradually falling out of active cultivation and reverting to the marshy, waterlogged grassland travelers see today, and a surrounding population that, rather than vanishing outright, appears to have dispersed into smaller, more scattered settlements across the same general region, the same Aymara-speaking communities whose descendants still live around Lake Titicaca today, farming, herding, and living within sight of monuments whose builders' names had already been lost to their own oral tradition by the time the first Spanish chronicler arrived to ask. By the time the Inca rose to regional dominance, roughly 3 to 4 centuries after Tiwanaku's monumental core fell silent, the ruins had already passed fully into the realm of sacred myth rather than remembered history, not forgotten, exactly, since the Inca clearly knew the site existed and treated it with genuine reverence, incorporating it directly into their own creation story as the place where the sun itself was born, but decisively disconnected, in whatever memory survived, from any specific knowledge of the people who had actually quarried the stone, carved the gateway, and built the drainage channels that once kept the Akapana's terraces from flooding. When Pedro Cieza de Leon arrived in the 1540s and asked local informants who had built it, the honest answer he received, "We do not know, it was already here," was not evasion or forgetting so much as a genuinely accurate report of a mystery that had already stood unsolved for roughly half a millennium by the time anyone thought to write it down. Modern archaeology has filled in a great deal of that gap since then, the radiocarbon chronology, the drainage engineering, the raised field agriculture, the experimental replication of the stone-cutting techniques at Puma Punku, enough to comfortably retire Poznański's mistaken 17,000-year dating and the various alien technology theories it inadvertently helped inspire. But a genuine core of the mystery remains stubbornly intact, in a way that is different from simply not having enough data yet. We do not know, with real confidence, what specific event or sequence of events actually broke a 5-century-old empire apart in what may have been as little as 2 or 3 decades. We do not fully know what the carved faces in the semi-subterranean temple were meant to represent, or what the 48 winged attendants on the gateway of the sun were actually counting, if they were counting anything at all. We do not know exactly how a body of stoneworking knowledge precise enough to still look startling more than 1,000 years later was organized, taught, and maintained across generations, or why, once Tiwanaku's political center collapsed, that specific expertise seems to have simply stopped being practiced anywhere in the Andes at anything like the same level of precision, ever again. Excavation at Puma Punku and across the wider Tiwanaku site is still active and still ongoing, and every field season continues to recover new fragments of carved stone, new sections of drainage channel, new pieces of a picture that grows more detailed without yet fully resolving into a complete answer. Somewhere on that cold, thin-aired plateau above Lake Titicaca, the people who built a city the Inca themselves called the birthplace of the sun left behind stones cut with a precision their own descendants could not explain, and a silence about their own ending that has now lasted almost exactly 1,000 years. We don't know, yet, exactly what broke first, the water, the walls, or something in between. But the ground is still giving up new pieces of the answer, one careful excavation season at a time, and for now, that will have to be enough.